Chapter 9. Survival Ethics. Religionists argue that God is necessary because man, left to his own devices, has no objective standard by which to measure right and wrong. A word like good has no value unless there is a God who can define it for you. Without God, why is helping someone preferable to harming him? A rapist believes it is fine to sexually assault women. Who am I to say that he's wrong, since we are both merely men with differing personal opinions? It's a good line until you realize that the religionists who use it don't even believe it. And this can be tested quite easily. Imagine a man who happens to be an atheist faced with the opportunity of placing an unusual bet with even 50-50 odds, a simple coin toss. If the result comes up heads, he will receive a huge cash prize of, say, £1 million. But if it's tails, then he must allow his wife to be viciously raped and tortured to within an inch of her life. According to the religionists' view of unbelievers, the man should have no worries about the potential outcome of the bet, because all actions and consequences are equally amoral. But in reality, no sane person, religious or otherwise, could look at the scenario in that light. This instinctive rejection of amorality has nothing to do with what is printed in the Bible. Why do we feel this way? Because choices have real-world consequences, and those consequences are either desirable or undesirable in relation to our nature as creatures. The Christian claims to obtain his ethics from the Bible. He hails this as the source for his objective, unchanging definitions of good and evil, because the laws come from the perfect mind of an eternal God rather than the variable opinions of man. Here's one example of these values. Quote, "If a man happens to meet a virgin who is not pledged to be married, and rapes her, and they are discovered, he shall pay her father 50 shekels of silver. He must marry the young woman, for he has violated her. He can never divorce her as long as he lives." End quote. Deuteronomy chapter 22, verses 28 to 29. Let's be objective about this Bible passage and place it in its historical context. In ancient Israel, the virginity of a young woman was highly prized. If this was violated, the woman's chances of obtaining a husband and raising a family became zero. She was forever tarnished. And to Israelites, a successful life was largely measured by how many children you produced. Odd as it may sound to modern ears, the passage above was actually trying to do rape victims a favour. Israelite women would probably have been grateful for the regulation, because without it, the lives of rape victims were essentially over. Our culture is vastly different. People live meaningful lives without bearing children. Virginity is not considered an essential attribute of a potential mate. Imagine a rape victim being told by the authorities, "You have to marry this man now, it's the law." I think we would be hard-pressed to find a Christian in the present day that would support this regulation for women. The sensible Christian realizes that we're not supposed to transpose Old Testament laws word for word into the 21st century because of the massive cultural differences. But the problem with taking this position is that we believe our modern civilization is ethically superior to Old Testament Israel. The culture of the people of Israel is the culture that the Judeo-Christian God put together in his wisdom, and it is a culture that defends the genital mutilation of children, Genesis chapter 17, verses 9 to 14, animal sacrifice, Leviticus chapter 1, verses 3 to 9, slavery, Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21, executing adulterers, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, executing witches, Exodus chapter 22, verse 18, and genocide, 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 to 3. Practices that no sane Christian would wish to reintroduce. In fact, if we're dealing with infinite wisdom, it's a disturbing mystery why God's early dealings with man took the form they did. So the modern Christian does not get his values from the Bible. He cherry-picks his rules and regulations, instead of accepting them all at face value as wisdom beyond human understanding. But what is the objective basis of this selectivity? That's an interesting question. It seems the Christian, like the atheist, is measuring the Bible against values he inherited from somewhere else, values that seem to be more important. This is a subtle admission of his own personal autonomy, that he doesn't truly need divine revelation to formulate meaningful ethics, but is he ready to admit this to himself? Christians also talk about the judgment of God in relation to ethics, as if our actions should be guided by our desire to escape punishment. This is the most infantile basis for ethics imaginable. Clearly, the reason why we do what we do is because we recognize that actions have consequences. If a man rapes a woman, the woman has to live with that permanently. The rapist might later go boo-hooing to God about what a terrible person he has become and how he needs forgiveness. But this totally misses the point of why ethics are important. Not because of future judgment by an offended deity, or indeed future reward for being obedient, but because your actions matter in the here and now. The consequences of your behavior upon yourself and others are permanent. Whatever it is you do, you can't take it back. Forgiveness of sin is a total irrelevance, taking our eyes off the importance of acting responsibly in the first place. Don't screw up, because there are no second chances where it really counts, in the world that you make with your actions. Culturally inherited values are not necessarily any better than religious principles. They may reflect our natural humanity, or they may not, depending on when and where we are born. Culture can function as yet another false external authority imposed upon our lives, sustained by the unquestioning minds of those that abide by it. To get to the heart of the matter, we must distinguish what is cultural from what is human. There is a scene in the movie Terminator 2 where the boy John Connor argues with the Terminator robot that had been programmed to protect him. Crucially, it was not programmed to protect anyone else. John argues, "You just can't go around killing people." The Terminator asks, without sentiment, "Why?" John responds, "What do you mean, why? Because you can't." Again, "Why?" John can't get through. The robot lacks humanity, human programming, if you prefer. Humans, even in the absence of religion and culture, are not blank slates. We have our humanity. Defining precisely what humanity is can be difficult, given that we all suffer cultural influence, but it is certainly not an illusion. This becomes clear when we look at ourselves in relation to the other animals. Notice how the rest of the animal kingdom gets along just fine without a Bible or a cultural value system. Consider the lion, fierce predator, social animal, and devoted parent, all without any need of stone tablets from a divine lawgiver. Don't make the mistake of assuming that the lion's behavior operates purely on instinct. According to the documentary The Truth About Lions, 2011, these cats are intelligent, demonstrating the ability to count and strategize when hunting. They possess a rich experience of consciousness, just like man. When a Christian accuses an atheist of having no basis for his ethical behavior, it's essentially the same as facing the lion and saying, "Why aren't you tearing each other to pieces? You have no objective moral grounds for getting along so well with your own kind." That would be ridiculous, wouldn't it? The underlying principle at work is this. Social animals create societies for themselves because that urge is in their nature. And it's in their nature because evolution favoured it. And evolution favoured it because survival is more assured when a species collaborates. Why would man, the animal, be any different? We are civilized because it works for our benefit. We also possess a capacity for aggression, but that is no contradiction. Like other animals, we need to defend our territory against attack, so our instincts equip us to fight. Alongside this, we have the ability to love. When an adult kisses a child with affection, it is not because he was instructed to perform this action by God, but because he feels affection on an instinctual level. Children develop ethics naturally, with or without the influence of religion. What we call the terrible twos is a period when a child goes through a process of realization that the world does not revolve around him and his needs. Gradually and painfully, under his parents' discipline, He learns to see himself as an aspect of his environment rather than as the center of the universe. He comes to understand that life is better when he obeys his parents' instructions instead of simply yelling in frustration. Whether God declared a particular action good or evil is irrelevant to a young child. If the parents are irresponsible, caving in to their child's every wish for the sake of a quiet life, they will pay the price in later years. They denied their child the valuable lesson of how to successfully integrate his individuality into a wider world of experience, and the terrible twos will become the terrible sixes or the terrible tens. There are tragic children who end up practically friendless at school. No one desires their companionship because they are all take and no give. As adults, we balance our individuality with the responsibilities of civilization every day because we learned a meaningful basis for ethical behavior as children, not because God wrote the 10 Commandments. The religionist's stance is based on a faulty analysis of man as separate from the animals, possessing an evil nature that needs to be cured by an outside agency. Sadly, the Christian, steeped in grossly inaccurate propaganda about human nature, might picture independent thinking as bringing about only barbaric chaos. If that were true, those who call themselves atheists should be the most brutal tribe in the world. But I don't see many atheists getting together to organize church burnings. Conversely, history shows that the widespread acquiescence to an externally imposed morality is a major rallying point on which the worst atrocities are committed, whether it is a heretic or witch burned at the stake for the crime of thinking different, or Christians and Muslims slaughtering each other for the glory of their respective gods. Yet perhaps my view of the essential goodness of the natural man is too romantic. What does man truly become when the constraints of law and order are removed? Let's do a little role play. Imagine a plague that wipes out the entire population of the planet, save for roughly 1 in every 1,000 persons. You are one of these survivors. Scared and alone, your first natural impulse is to find companionship. Others are thinking in the same fashion. Soon you become a group of 15, including men, women, and children. Codependency ensues, as each member uses his individual strengths for the mutual benefit of the whole. One of the members has strong leadership abilities. He suggests stocking up on supplies from a local supermarket, then heading for the countryside. The aim is to find an isolated house, well away from the inevitable disease of the decaying corpses and the potential threat of encountering a gang of unfriendly survivors. Once your new home is established, the group turns its attention away from immediate survival to long-term survival. Canned goods will not last indefinitely, so you all get busy learning how to farm the land and hunt game. After a great deal of effort, the future looks relatively bright and safe. Then one day, 2 strangers stumble upon your property. The men seem friendly, but you are cautious. They quickly charm their way into the group's confidence. Finally, they make their move, sensing your civilized friends to be easy pickings. But they haven't counted on your lingering suspicions. You get the drop on them before they can do any serious harm. Keeping them at gunpoint, you escort them beyond the boundary of your property, well away from the eyes of the others. In a civilized society, such men would now be put in prison. But that world is gone, and it's simply not practical to imprison them yourself. Resources are already strained without the added burden of 2 unproductive mouths to feed, not to mention living with the potential of the villains breaking free and killing you in your sleep. You are faced with a clear choice: release them or kill them. You weigh the potential consequences of letting them go. They might be grateful for being spared and thus never return, or they might be angry at being thwarted and return with a vengeance. They could be lone wanderers or scouts from a larger group of like-minded parasites. The worst-case scenario is a whole gang showing up on your doorstep to steal your food supplies, rape your women, and destroy your home. You realize that if you let the men go, the only safe option is to uproot your whole group, move to another location, and start over, leaving behind all of the crops you have planted. If you choose this option, how will you get through the coming winter without starving? And what's to stop this same circumstance from happening all over again? All of this worry goes away if you just pull the trigger. Could you do it? In this situation, the most dangerous person to the well-being of your group is the one who is too compassionate to do what needs to be done to keep everyone safe. Post-apocalyptic fiction often provides a rich canvas for exploring morality. A notable fictional character is the convicted murderer Tom Price from the TV series Survivors, 2008. While the other members of his group are clinging to the morals of a civilization that was recently obliterated due to plague, Tom is the guy who is willing to simply do what needs to be done to keep his group alive. When the others cannot face stealing from another clan of survivors, Tom will do it. When the others haven't got the stomach to kill an enemy who would surely return in greater numbers, Tom will do it. The others hypocritically wash their hands of such dirty jobs, but secretly they know that if it weren't for Tom, they would all be dead by now. While this is merely fiction, it illustrates a powerful message. Any ethical system that defines conflict as evil is destined to fail. When our definitions of good fail to make room for the necessity of aggressive action, we become the prey. Animals know this instinctively, whereas many humans are melodramatically preaching, all you need is love. Some may react to this assessment by saying, I would rather die than become a thief and a killer. Unfortunately, anyone who promotes such a noble thought is not only ensuring his own demise, but sowing the seeds of destruction for all who would cling to such an ideal, thereby destroying the ideal itself. An ethical system built upon a foundation of pacifism is untenable simply because the practice of such a stance leads to its own doom. Any workable system must, of necessity, embrace conflict, for the simple reason that life brings adversity. Of course, I am by no means advocating looting and killing as acceptable behaviour for us in the present day. In a fully functioning society, we recognise the benefits of law and order and support them accordingly. But moral absolutism for all circumstances is impossible. If you doubt that, then simply tell me where this objective standard of morality is to be found. The Christian will say, in the Bible. But would that be the Bible interpreted by a medieval Christian embarking on a crusade or beheading a heretic? Or the Bible interpreted by a Christian from the early part of the 20th century for whom dancing and cinema were sins? Or a contemporary Christian from any number of denominations, strict and liberal? Everywhere we look, so-called objective morality is engaged in an unending process of change. There is no place where we can find the absolute standard for all time. In the general run of life, most of us will gladly subject ourselves to becoming law-abiding citizens and reap the benefits. But imagine a government that decides to steal children from loving parents and turn them into soldiers. How many of us would remain law-abiding citizens then? Morality has always been, and always will be, a matter of personal pragmatism. Even those who deny that observation will find themselves unavoidably using it when a dreadful situation can be avoided by simply telling a lie. As circumstances change, so do the rules we make for ourselves. When you understand that man is qualitatively no different from the rest of the animals, then observation of the animal kingdom yields much wisdom. We learn that what works for the lion is not what works for the lamb. Each species acts in accordance with its own unique evolutionary development. There is no one standard for all, but a multiplicity of choice based on a universally desired outcome: survival. Post-apocalyptic fiction has its bad guys, often portrayed as men who would rape and pillage without conscience, spending their days scavenging on the decaying corpse of the old world, rather than working to build a new civilization. Would we all regress to such an appalling level if given the opportunity? No doubt some would. More importantly, what would be the ratio of cooperative, forward-thinking individuals to destructive parasites. We can bypass all speculation because the bottom line is this. Despite countless wars and genocides, despite thousands of conflicting ideologies, no matter where we look, civilization exists. It needs no other justification than the observable evidence of its own success. In the grand scheme of nature's stratification, the civilized have beaten the uncivilized in the game of life. Even a villain will see the benefit of strength in numbers. For any street gang or criminal organization to survive, there must be adherence to a code of conduct, or the group disintegrates due to anarchy. The need to civilize ourselves is an inescapable practical necessity, even amongst the lowest of us. People are capable of taking responsibility for their own actions without any guidance from a higher power, because such responsibility is a natural fact of life across the entire animal kingdom. The limbic brain of mammals empowers them to take an interest in the survival needs of their family or tribe, instead of engaging only in reptilian, selfish concern for individual survival. Survival is, after all, made easier through collaboration. Man's neocortical brain allows him to go one step further. Life is not so fraught with danger for many of us as it is for our cousins in the animal kingdom. When there is safety and abundance, our urge to survive is given the opportunity to flower into an interest in mutual prosperity. There is no double standard concerning a man who, in a life filled with plenty, would be a kind-hearted sharer, and in a life filled with lack, a cold-blooded killer. It must be understood that personal survival is the necessary first step on a path that has the potential of reaching altruism at its end. Just as water transforms itself into ice or steam depending on the temperature, so our behavior must change in relation to our circumstances. This is a far cry from flimsy moral relativism, where one standard is no better or worse than any other. This is nothing less than a scientific stance on morality, based on realism about human behavior. We may not always agree on precisely what moral judgments to make in individual cases, but we have identified the core principle on which meaningful ethics are based: individual and group survival. We must be good to ourselves before we can be good to others. And why is it that we feel happy when we do something altruistic? Not because we are spiritual, but because our evolutionary development has imbued us with the type of brain that makes such behavior desirable. I suspect this was all a lot clearer to our hunter-gatherer ancestors who lived in small tribes and moved from place to place. The survival of the individual and the survival of the group were one and the same. Man could not survive alone, and the group could not survive without the collaboration of its members. Although life would have been much harsher than it is today, I can't help but think that a hunter-gatherer would have felt much more self-worth than a typical modern human. The tribe was made stronger through each individual's contribution. By contrast, modern man lives in a world that tells him he is unnecessary. He must compete against all his fellows for gainful employment. If he never gets a job, the great machine of civilization is no worse off, because somebody else will fill the position. A great deal of crime happens, not because man is evil, but because modern man has been forced into a state of alienation from his neighbours. Modern man is tribeless, and we instinctively feel the wrongness of that. I have a pet theory that our fascination with post-apocalyptic fiction comes from our feelings of dissatisfaction with modern civilization. We secretly long for a more authentic human experience of tribalism, of belonging. But we have to deal with the world as it is, where we are forced to play dog-eat-dog with our neighbours or perish. Meanwhile, we utter a subtle cry for help as we compulsively litter social media with anecdotes from our lives, craving validation that we matter to someone other than ourselves. We walk all over people to stay alive, then beg them to love us because we feel so alone. And it's not our fault. Here we are in the great melting pot of modern civilization, struggling to be authentically human in an overcrowded world that doesn't fit our true nature. No one is good or evil. These terms become obsolete when we understand the workings of our own brains. We see that we are both good and evil. Ethics provide a spectrum of behavior rather than a strict polarity of opposites. I am in some ways a responsible adult, and in other ways a rascal. I enjoy a high degree of moral stability, but there are also moments of relaxing decadence. I have helped someone in need and felt the joy of altruism. I have also done things that later filled me with self-loathing. I make this confession without embarrassment, because I know there is nothing particularly good or particularly evil about me, just like you. A more descriptive word for evil is criminality, and the essence of criminality is the taking of a shortcut. For example, a band brings out a new album, and a percentage of the fans download the music illegally from the internet instead of buying it from a retailer. An unemployed man wants to experience the thrill of driving a sports car. Instead of getting a job and saving sufficient money to buy a car, he breaks into one and takes it for a joyride. A woman in an adulterous relationship persuades her lover to murder her rich husband so that she can inherit his wealth prematurely. A sexually frustrated man doesn't want the lengthy task of seducing a woman, so when he spies a naive girl walking home late at night, alone and vulnerable, he rapes her. If we're brutally honest, we're all at least a little bit criminal. We all take shortcuts, even if they are only minor ones. Some of you may be reading this in the form of an illegally downloaded ebook, you rascals. The human drama exists because everyone individually decides which shortcuts are worth the risk. Not only risk of prosecution, but also risk to the human psyche. You have to be able to live with the psychological consequences of your choices, because you will be judged by your own humanity. Sometimes we attempt to justify an action that we feel is wrong, to make the action feel right and thus eliminate guilt. This is all well and good if the negativity has been externally imposed from culture or religion. For instance, I would once have felt guilty for working on a Sunday, but no longer. Personal experience has also taught me that this tactic never works when you attempt to strive against your humanity. Hours after committing a questionable act that I've tried to justify, I might find myself suddenly flying off the handle because of a minor irritation, such as struggling to unscrew the lid from a jar of peanut butter. 1 minute earlier, I wasn't even aware that I was angry. Now I am ready to throw the jar across the kitchen. When a tiny frustration triggers such a massive overreaction, something big is clearly going on internally. I'm angry with myself, of course. Despite my rationalization of the original act, there's no fooling myself. My humanity is a quality that runs deeper than thought, and I would be wise to listen to it. A memorable example of this, whether true or legendary, is Judas Iscariot betraying Jesus to the chief priests for 30 pieces of silver. Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 to 16. Afterwards, he discovered that he couldn't live with the consequences of his actions, so he hanged himself. Matthew chapter 27, verses 1 to 5. His humanity wouldn't let him get away with his criminality. It strikes me that the criminal mind must be a deeply unhappy place. Ironically, the criminal wishes to deepen his enjoyment of life using ill-gotten gains, only to find his happiness tainted by the nagging inner voice of his humanity. Catch 22. The greatest hurdle I face in maintaining my own personal ethical aspirations is the fact that I'm striving to overcome a lifetime of bad habits. Habits that have formed as a result of unwise choices and decades of confusion about what it means to be human. When a person finds it easy to do good, that's not a sign he's particularly special. It's just a result of having nurtured positive habits. For instance, if I find someone's wallet on the street, it comes naturally to me to return it intact to the owner. Someone else discovering the wallet might choose to pocket the cash. Now, I could give myself a big pat on the back and congratulate myself on what a fine human being I am. But the truth is, there are also parts of me that I don't like, behavior patterns that I know are detrimental to me, but I find extremely hard to overcome. What we think of as our identity is largely the crystallization of our repeated behaviours into something that now comes habitually to us. What's ironic is that if a person acts in a way that is not in keeping with his established identity, we call him a phony. But the only way to change who you are is to act in that non-habitual way until, by a process of repetition, a new habit is crystallized and the old one erodes. Crystal is a good metaphor, because bad habits can be hard to break. Some of mine are so ingrained that they might haunt me till the day I die. It helps to recognize that identity itself is something fluid. There is no true you defined by fixed and immovable characteristics, except perhaps some foundational aspects of your behavior that are due to your own particular genetics. The larger part of you is down to the choices you have made, choices that grew into habits, and habits that grew into an identity. The use of ethics is basically the use of the neocortical region of the brain to govern the limbic and reptilian regions. It's worth noting that there is a vast difference in meaning between govern and suppress. The latter is like a government that rules with an iron fist, refusing to concern itself with the needs of the people. In the end, it has a bloody revolution on its hands. Similarly, your natural instincts will not be restrained and denied. Those who attempt this may end up in a psychological mess. Governing our animal passions involves expressing them responsibly and sublimating them when necessary, never suppressing them. Everything I've just explained about ethics may still seem erroneous to Christians because they have a different idea about the function of ethics. To them, an action is wrong principally because it offends God. They are not accustomed to the entirely practical notion of an action being considered wrong simply because it adversely affects civilization. I sense that a great deal of debate between religionists and secularists could be simplified if both sides recognized this fundamental difference in approach. Ethics do not require a divine lawgiver. They are a natural consequence of brain development. In this realistic context, ethics could be defined not as the overcoming of natural instinct through supernatural guidance, but as the fine-tuning of natural instinct in the interests of individual and group survival and prosperity. If you want to live a life that is satisfying, strive to live in harmony with your humanity.